She was the queen who built his throne with her bare hands, and he used it to bury her alive. Lyra Ashbourne stood before the entire court, pregnant, trembling, falsely accused, and watched the man she loved choose another woman's comfort over the truth burning in her eyes. They called it justice. They called it law. What it was a king so afraid of his own weakness that he destroyed the one person who never flinched when she looked at him. This is not a story about a woman who survived. This is a story about what she became because of it. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my wolves are watching from tonight. The morning it ended began the same way every other morning had for 4 years, with Lyra waking before the king, before the servants, before the palace itself had shaken off the cold dark of the northern night. She dressed without a mirror. She ate standing near the window because she could not sit still. The pregnancy had taken the softness from her sleep 6 weeks ago and replaced it with a low, persistent ache that started in her lower spine and radiated outward like a bruise that never surfaced. She pressed her palm flat against the swell of her stomach through the cotton of her undergarment and stood there for a moment in the gray light, alone, watching frost melt down the glass. She was 17 weeks along. She had not yet told anyone but the palace physician, who had sworn silence at her request. She wanted to tell Kaelen herself, in the right moment, with the right words. She had been rehearsing those words for 9 days. That particular window of stillness, her hand against the warmth of her abdomen, the frost dissolving on the glass, the palace sleeping around her, was the last piece Lyra Ashbourne would know for 5 years. The grand anniversary gathering was Kaelen's idea. 300 nobles, territorial lords, allied pack leaders, and foreign dignitaries assembled in the capital's main hall for a celebration of the empire's 72nd year. Banners in deep crimson and silver hung from the vaulted ceiling. Fires burned in 6 iron hearths along the eastern wall. The hall smelled of pine wood and roasting meat and the particular heavy sweetness of beeswax candles, a smell Lyra would spend the next 5 years unable to fully forget, no matter how hard she tried. She had spent the afternoon reviewing the seating arrangements with the head steward and confirming the ceremonial order with the Lord Chancellor. This was her work, the invisible architecture of these events, the 1,000 small decisions that kept a gathering of 300 egos from collapsing into territorial insult. Kaelen attended the celebrations. Lyra built them. She changed into her formal gown in the royal chamber without help. Dark green velvet, fitted at the waist, long sleeves, nothing that would reveal the slight forward curve of her belly to eyes that were not specifically looking for it. She fastened the silver chain at her throat, a wedding gift from Kaelen's mother, who had died 2 winters past, and checked her reflection once. She was not beautiful the way Celine was beautiful. She knew that. Celine moved through rooms like something carved for the purpose, all long lines and deliberate angles, each gesture designed to be watched. Lyra moved through rooms like someone who had work to do inside them. She had never considered that a disadvantage until Celine arrived. Celine had come to court 8 months ago as part of a diplomatic entourage from the Eastern Territories, and she had stayed, as such women sometimes stayed, through a combination of proximity, patience, and the particular talent for appearing indispensable to powerful men who had begun to feel restless. Kaelen called her a valuable political contact. He called their meetings strategic. He said her name with a careful neutrality that told Lyra everything she needed to know, but which she had been choosing, carefully and deliberately, not to know. There is a particular kind of pain that lives inside a person who has decided not to feel something yet. Lyra had been carrying that pain for 4 months. She had become very skilled at walking with it. She arrived at the great hall early. The fires were lit. Servants moved along the edges of the room in their formal gray. The high table was set with the kingdom's ceremonial silver, goblets, platters, the twin candelabras that had stood at the head of the kingdom's formal feasts for 3 generations. Lyra stood at the threshold of the room for a moment and looked at all of it. The careful, beautiful, fragile construction of an empire that she helped hold together with work no one would ever name. And then she walked in and took her seat at Kaelen's left. He arrived 20 minutes later with Celine at his side. Not behind him, not among his retinue. At his side, 1 step back and 1 step left, in the precise position that a consort occupied. She wore white. a provocation so deliberate it could only have been calculated. Her dark hair was pinned with silver combs that Lyra recognized as having come from the royal treasury's secondary vault. She had been given access to the secondary vault. That single fact settled in Lyra's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She did not look at Kaelen. She looked at her goblet and breathed. Kaelen took his seat without greeting her. He leaned toward the lord on his right and said something low that produced quiet laughter. The feast began. Through the first course and into the second, Lyra spoke to the territorial lords on either side of her with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years, because she had. She asked about trade routes and harvest yields and the ongoing border friction in the southern territories with the genuine interest of a woman who had spent 4 years learning that the strength of an empire lived in its edges, not its center. She ate carefully. She drank water, not wine, because of the child no one knew about yet. She kept her face composed and her hands still. She was very, very good at this. She had always been very good at this. Celine watched her from across the table with the flat, specific attention of a woman who has already decided how something is going to end. It was Lord Brennan, a fat, red-faced man from the eastern districts who owed his title to 3 generations of careful political loyalty and absolutely nothing else, who first raised the subject. He did it loudly enough that the immediate section of the table went quiet, which she understood later had not been accidental. "Your Grace," he said, speaking not to Lyra but to Kaelen, "I've been hearing troubling things from my informants in the northern trade corridors. There are letters moving between the palace and the Vakar separatist factions." The hall did not go silent. It went careful. That careful quality of attention, people still talking, still gesturing, still lifting forks, but all of it aimed inward, listening. "Is that so?" Kaelen said. He had not looked at Lyra. His voice was level, but she could hear the particular flatness in it that meant something had been discussed and decided before this moment. The stone in her chest began to shift. "My sources are reliable," Lord Brennan said. "The letters bear a seal, a woman's seal." He paused. "The Queen's seal." The word landed in the room the way a blade lands on stone, not with softness, not with weight, but with a sharp, clarifying sound that changes the nature of the air. Lyra put down her fork. "That's a serious accusation, my lord," she said. Her voice was level, her hands were flat on the table. "It's not an accusation, Your Grace," Lord Brennan said, and he smiled at her. "It's a report." "Then your report is false." She held his gaze. "I have no contact with Vakar factions. I have never had contact with Vakar factions. I have spent 4 years working to suppress Vakar activity in the northern districts, as the Lord Chancellor can confirm." "The Chancellor's records are under review," said another voice. Lyra turned. The voice belonged to the man she did not know. Seated among Celine's original entourage, placed deliberately near the head of the table months ago, she now realized. He had the precise, careful diction of someone trained in legal argument. "There are discrepancies in the northern border accounts that have been traced to correspondence originating inside the palace." "Traced by whom?" Lyra said. "By the Crown's intelligence office," the man said. "I oversee the Crown's intelligence correspondence in the Queen's capacity," Lyra said. "I have never received a report of any such investigation." "The investigation was conducted above the Queen's oversight level," he said, "given that the Queen herself was the subject of the investigation." The room had gone fully, completely quiet now. Not even the pretense of side conversation remained. 300 people were listening. The fires crackled in the iron hearths. One of the candelabras threw unsteady light across the silver of the table and made the shadows move. Lyra looked at Kaelen. He was looking at the table in front of him. "Kaelen," she said. Just his name, just that. He looked up. His face was the face she had known for 4 years. The jaw she had pressed her fingers against in the dark, the eyes she had watched across diplomatic tables and morning meals and the long, sleepless nights after difficult decisions. But those eyes were wrong now. They were the eyes of a man who had already finished the conversation he was about to pretend to start. "The allegations are serious," he said. "They're fabricated," she said. The word came out clean and flat, and she was grateful for it. You know they're fabricated. I know you say they are. The distinction was a knife, 3 words, delivered quietly by the man who had shared her bed for 4 years. She felt the child move inside her, a faint, uncertain flutter, like something trying to decide whether to stay. Let me see the letters, she said. Let me see the supposed correspondence. If my seal was used, I will tell you exactly when and where it was used and for what purpose. If letters exist, I can account for every document that has carried my seal in the past 3 years. I keep records. The letters have been secured as evidence, Lord Brennan said. Then show me the evidence, she said. That is a basic right of any accused person, regardless of station. The situation is politically sensitive, the legal man said smoothly. In the interest of the kingdom's stability, Lyra said, and now her voice had an edge in it that she did not try to remove. You will let the accused see the evidence against her, or you will tell this entire hall precisely why you won't. She looked at the men around the table, the lords, the pack leaders, the foreign dignitaries watching with expressions ranging from discomfort to fascination. Because these men are all witnesses. Whatever is decided in this room tonight is decided in front of witnesses. That produced a moment of silence of a different quality. A few of the lords shifted. One of the older territorial leaders, a white-haired man named Voss who had known Lyra's father, looked at Kaelen with something that was not quite accusation, but was not far from it. Kaelen stood up. He did not look at her when he stood. He looked at the assembled court, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man delivering a speech he memorized weeks ago. The Crown takes these allegations with the gravity they demand. The security of the Empire cannot be compromised by sentiment or personal loyalty until the investigation is concluded, and in the interest of the kingdom's safety and my own neutrality in the matter. He paused. Queen Lyra is hereby suspended from all royal functions pending a full review. There was a sound in the room that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. It was the sound of 300 people recalibrating. Lyra stood. The chair scraped back on the stone floor. You're making a mistake, she said. She was not pleading. She was stating a fact with the directness of someone reading an inventory. The council will conduct the review, Kaelen said. In the meantime, you'll be confined to the eastern wing. Kaelen. She said his name again. She would remember later that she said it with the same tone she used when waking him from nightmares, firm and quiet and aimed at the person underneath the public performance. Look at me. He did. And in his eyes, she saw something that destroyed her more completely than any accusation. She saw relief. The relief of a man who had found a usable story. The relief of a man who had been looking for a door and had finally been handed one. She understood then, with the cold clarity of genuine comprehension, that this had been arranged, not by enemies at a distance, by people close enough to have mapped her habits, copied her seal, moved inside her trust. And he had not arranged it. She did not believe that even then, but he had looked at it when it was handed to him and chosen not to look away. She was 5 months pregnant with his child. She chose not to say it. Not here, not like this, not as a negotiation or a bargain or a plea. The child was not currency. She would not spend it. I will not go to the eastern wing, she said. Lyra. His voice, for the first time, had something human in it. Warning or guilt or something that had not quite killed the ability to feel. Don't make this worse. I am not the one making this worse, she said. It was Celine who moved. She rose from her place at the table with the slow, deliberate composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times it had become reflex. She placed her hand on Kaelen's arm, not the gesture of comfort, but the gesture of ownership, delivered in front of the full court with the precision of a woman who understood the grammar of public spectacle. My lord, Celine said softly, the kingdom needs stability. The table watched. The fires burned. And Kaelen, the man who had once told Lyra in the dark of early morning that she was the only person in the empire he fully trusted, looked from Celine to Lyra and back to Celine, and then he looked at Lord Brennan and gave a single, small nod. What happened after that happened quickly. The guard captain was at the door. 2 of his men moved toward the table. They were not rough. They were correct and formal, and they had clearly been briefed. One of them said, "Your Grace," and offered his arm as if assisting a guest. Lyra looked at his arm. She looked at the guard. She looked at the entire hall watching her from across 300 plates of half-eaten food and the light of a dozen candelabras. And then she straightened her spine until it ached, and she walked out of the great hall under her own power, without touching anyone's arm, without looking back. She heard Celine sit back down behind her. She heard Kaelen say, "Continue the feast." She heard the low, uncertain murmur of conversation resuming, reluctant, rattled, but resuming. The doors of the great hall closed behind her. The corridor outside was cold and empty, and lit by wall-mounted torches that threw orange light in uneven pulses. Lyra stood in it for a long moment, with her hands pressed flat against her stomach and her breath coming in careful, controlled intervals. Her body wanted to shake. She would not let it. Not here. Not in a corridor where any servant, any guard, any spy with instructions to report her reactions could observe the shaking. She walked to the eastern wing because refusing had no point now, and she understood the territory of losing fights. The eastern wing was not a dungeon. It was a set of comfortable rooms that had been prepared in advance, fresh linens, a fire already burning, food laid on the side table. The preparation confirmed what the legal man's smooth diction and Lord Brennan's carefully timed accusation had already told her. This had been in motion for weeks. The machinery had been running while she reviewed seating arrangements and coordinated ceremonial orders and slept in the same bed as the man who had quietly signed her warrant. She sat on the edge of the bed and she let herself feel it, because she was alone and because suppressing it would take energy she might need later. The grief was not the grief of romantic betrayal, that smaller, more personal pain. What she felt was larger and less clean, the grief of misidentification. 4 years of reading a person daily and closely and having read them wrong. Not entirely wrong, Chatti. She still did not believe he was the one who built the trap. But wrong in the part that mattered. Wrong about what he would choose when choosing cost him something. She had not read him wrong. She had read him right and decided it didn't matter. That was the true thing underneath the grief, and it tasted like iron. She did not sleep. In the morning, Lord Chancellor Harwick came to see her. He was a thin, precise man of 63 who had served 3 administrations and who communicated through understatement with the same discipline that a surgeon communicates through instruments. He sat in the chair across from the cold fireplace and folded his hands and looked at her with an expression of controlled, formal dismay. "The situation has moved faster than anticipated," he said. "Were you anticipating it?" she said. A pause. "There have been tensions in the council that I should have brought to your grace sooner. I regret that I did not." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "The letters are fabrications. I believe you already know this, but I want to state it clearly. The seal was copied. The correspondence was placed in the Northern Trade Records no more than 6 weeks ago. The evidence trail has been constructed backward. It begins with the conclusion and works toward the premise. Can you prove that?" "I have 3 days of work that suggests it strongly. Proof that would stand in a royal hearing." He paused. "That is a more complicated question." "How complicated?" "The council that would hear the case has been restructured. The new appointments were made over the past 4 months. The men who now hold the majority on the review council." He stopped. He unfolded and refolded his hands. "They were appointed at Lady Celena's recommendation. The shape of it settled. The Eastern Territories. 8 months. Diplomatic entourage. And before that, months of groundwork, names placed in positions, leverage acquired, a king who had begun to feel restless cultivated with patient attention. This was not improvised. This was architecture." "What does the king know?" Lyra asked. "I believe His Majesty knows the allegations are questionable," Harwick said carefully. "I do not believe he knows the depth of the fabrication. And if he did know the depth of it?" Harwick was silent. "Would it change anything?" she said. He looked at her with the honest eyes of an old man who had seen too many courts to lie about what he saw in this one. "I don't know," he said. "I'm sorry to tell you that I genuinely do not know." She nodded once. "What's going to happen?" "The review council will convene in 2 days. Given the composition, they'll find against me. I believe so, yes. And then? Sentencing is at the king's discretion, Harwick said. In treason cases, the crown has several options: imprisonment, permanent removal from court, exile. The words sat in the cold air of the room. Beyond the borders, she said. That would be the harshest form, he said. The northern wastes beyond the empire's formal boundary. Lyra stood and walked to the window. Outside, the capital was beginning its morning. Smoke rising from chimneys, carts moving along the lower streets, the palace guard changing at the main gates in the gray early light. She had watched this view hundreds of times from the royal chamber 2 floors up and 60 meters west. From this angle, slightly lower, slightly east, the city looked the same, but the light was different. Even a small shift in position changed what you could see. Harwick, she said, Your Grace. Can you get a message to my brother in the Southern Territories without it being intercepted? A pause. Possibly. Tell him nothing about the situation. Tell him only... She stopped. She thought about her brother Edric, younger by 4 years, stationed at the Southern garrison, loyal to a fault, and completely without subtlety. If he came here, they would use him against her. No, tell him nothing. If he comes here, they'll put him in a cell to keep me quiet. Then what would you have me do? She turned from the window. Keep your records, she said. Whatever you find about the letter fabrications. Keep meticulous records and secure them somewhere they cannot be searched. Don't show them to the council. Don't show them to anyone. Just keep them. Keep all of it. He looked at her with that honest, careful expression. For what purpose? Because I intend to be alive to use them eventually, she said. And because if something happens to me... She stopped. She looked at him with the specific directness she used when she needed someone to hear her precisely. If something happens to me, I want there to be a record of what was done and who built it. Not for revenge, for the truth. Because the truth has weight, Harwick, even when no one is alive to lift it. He nodded slowly. I will keep the records, he said. You have my word. The review council convened on the second morning. Lyra was permitted to speak for 12 minutes. The legal man from Celine's entourage spoke for 40. The council deliberated for 1 hour, a duration that told her everything about how much deliberation had actually occurred. They returned a finding of probable cause on 2 counts of treason-adjacent conduct, the providing of sensitive border intelligence to hostile factions, and the use of royal resources to fund separatist activity. Neither count specified the Vacar in particular, which was legally convenient since attaching specifics would have made the fabrication easier to disprove. Lyra listened to the reading of the finding without moving her face. She had prepared herself for it. Preparation does not prevent impact, but it changes the character of impact, from collapse to something harder, something that bends without giving way entirely. The sentencing hearing was that afternoon. Kaelen presided. He was dressed in full formal regalia, the crimson and silver of the empire, the chain of state across his chest. He looked, she thought, exactly as a king should look. That was the thing about Kaelen. He always looked exactly right. He had been born with the ability to inhabit the surface of authority so completely that most people never thought to ask what was underneath it. He knew what was underneath it. She had known him well enough, long enough, to have seen the unguarded version. The version that woke from nightmares and sat at the edge of the bed in the dark. The version that admitted fear in a whisper, because he could not say it any louder. The version that had once told her she was the only honest thing in the palace. That version was sitting somewhere behind the man on the throne, watching the machinery run and choosing not to stop it. That was the cruelest part. It was a choice. It was always a choice. The council has returned its finding, Kaelen said. His voice was formal, ceremonial, carved from the same material as the chain on his chest. In consideration of the severity of the charges and the threat they represent to the Empire's security, Kaelen, she said. He stopped. She had not planned to say his name again, but she said it because there was still, underneath everything, underneath the cold and the anger and the quiet grief, a part of her that wanted him to hear his own name from her mouth one more time and understand what it meant. Not as a plea, as a record, as a mark on the wall. He looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not regret, or not only regret, but something that would take a year of distance and silence and the long, cold nights in the wastelands to name correctly. She would name it eventually. She had always been patient with difficult language. Exile, he said, beyond the Empire's northern boundary, effective immediately. There was a sound in the hearing chamber that was not sound, a held breath, a collective intake, the sensation of something irrevocable being sealed. Celine was seated to Kaelen's right, in the position that Lyra had occupied at every formal proceeding for 4 years. Her expression was composed, her hands were folded in her lap. She did not look at Lyra at all, which was its own kind of message. The message of a woman who has already moved past the current problem and is looking at the next one. Lyra stood. She did not look at the council. She did not look at the Lord Chancellor, who had gone very still at his place at the edge of the room. She looked at Kaelen one last time, and she thought, against all useful instinct, against all common sense, of the child. 17 weeks and 2 days, moving now and then in the quiet moments, alive and not yet sentenced to anything. She did not say it. She walked out. They allowed her 3 hours to gather her possessions, a practical grace that told her the exile order had a departure time attached, and that the departure time was that night. 2 guards accompanied her to the royal chamber. They waited outside the door. She gathered practical things, wool, leather, waterproof boots she had purchased 3 years ago for a border inspection trip and never worn again, a hunting knife, a medical kit, dried rations from the emergency supplies she had personally requisitioned for the palace stores 2 winters ago. She worked quickly and without sentimentality. She left the green velvet gown on the bed. She left the silver chain on the vanity. She took the hunting knife and the warm boots and the rations, and she did not look back at the room where she had slept for 4 years. The northern gate was opened for her at midnight. The temperature beyond the gate was 20 degrees below what it had been inside the capital walls. The Empire's border ward, a series of magical suppression structures built into the northern boundary, shimmered in the darkness like heat haze, except cold. The guard captain informed her, in a professionally neutral tone, that the ward was set to repel re-entry for a period of not less than 5 years. After that, the terms of exile could be reviewed at the Crown's discretion. 5 years. She was carrying a child no one knew about. She was 17 weeks pregnant, and it was midnight, and the temperature was lethal, and she was standing at the edge of the known world with a pack on her back and a knife on her belt. "Move," the captain said, not unkindly, just practically. She moved. The ward hit her like a wall of cold that was not temperature, a deep structural cold that pressed against something inside her chest and pushed. She walked through it in 3 steps that felt like wading through freezing water. And then she was on the other side, and the capital's lights were behind her, and the northern wastes were ahead, dark and vast and completely indifferent to her survival. She walked. She walked because stopping was death, and she was not ready to die. She walked because the child was alive and she owed it that much. She walked because there was something alive in her chest underneath the grief and the cold, something that was not hope, not yet, not anything as warm or specific as hope, but something that functioned like direction. She walked because somewhere in the dark northern wastes, far from the Empire's lights, and its fabricated evidence, and its careful political king, she might find enough room to figure out what she was now. The snow started on the 3rd hour, not drifting, driving, horizontal, the kind of snow that found every gap in wool and pressed ice against skin. She found a shallow rock overhang on the 4th hour and pressed herself into it and breathed through the cold until her body stopped trying to shake and settled into the grim mechanical business of maintaining temperature. She put her back to the stone and her hands on her stomach, and she sat there in the dark with the wind making it sound around the edges of the rock, and she thought, with the flat, clear-eyed honesty of someone who has nothing left to protect, about what survival was going to require. It was going to require that she stop thinking about him. Not now, maybe. Not tonight. But soon. It was going to require that she eat and find water and move toward shelter before the storm worsened, because the child was real, and the cold was real, and grief was a luxury that existed at a temperature above 15 below. It was going to require that she become something she had not planned to become, not the queen who built other people's thrones, not the woman who made the invisible work that held empires together while men put their names on the result. Something harder. something with no surface for others to put their hands on. She reached into her pack and ate half a dried ration block in methodical, practical bites. She drank from the water skin before it could freeze. She adjusted the wool around her throat and checked her fingers for numbness and found them cold but functional. She was alive. She was going to stay alive. Not for him. Not against him. Not for the kingdom or the throne or the court that had watched her walked out of a feast with the flat attention of people watching an animal be relocated. She was going to stay alive because the child was moving again. That faint, uncertain flutter, insistent and small and completely unknowing of the cold outside her skin, and because something had changed in her chest when they walked her through that gate. Something that felt, in the strange clarity of genuine extremity, less like loss and more like the first drafts of a different kind of power. He had sent her out here to disappear. She intended to be very thorough about it. She pulled her pack closer and closed her eyes and let herself drift toward something that was not quite sleep. The shallow, alert rest of a person who has decided to survive the night first and figure out everything else in the morning. The wind moved. The rock was cold against her back. The child was alive inside her. She was alive. When dawn broke gray and brutal over the northern wastes, Lyra Ashbourne stood up, checked her bearings against the position of the pale sun, adjusted the weight of her pack, and walked north. Not because north was salvation, because north was away, and away was the only direction that mattered for now. 3 days later, half-starved and frostbitten at 2 fingertips and running on the particular fuel of a woman who had made a promise to a child who could not yet hear it, she stumbled into a small outpost village at the edge of the Empire's formal maps. It had no name on official charts. It had perhaps 40 people, most of them exiles, and a healer who took one look at her fingers and her face and the careful way she held her midsection and said, without particular gentleness, "You're pregnant and half dead. Which would you like me to deal with first?" "Neither," Lyra said. "I need work, whatever kind of work this place has." The healer looked at her for a long moment. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with hands like carved wood and the eyes of someone who had been making practical decisions in difficult conditions for a very long time. "Can you read?" she asked. "I can read 6 languages," Lyra said. "I can balance accounts, manage supply chains, negotiate trade agreements, and I know the legal codes of the 3 major empires well enough to find inconsistencies in under an hour. I can also hunt, dress a wound, and build a fire in conditions most trained soldiers would call unsurvivable." She held the healer's gaze. "So yes, I can read." The healer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your name?" Lyra thought about it. The name Ashbourne belonged to a queen who had been exiled. The name Lyra belonged to a woman who had made a fatal error in judgment and paid for it in a currency she would be calculating for years. Neither name was useful here. "Mira," she said. The first name that came to her, not random, but chosen, because it came from the old northern dialect word for silver light on dark water. Because she had seen that light on the ice on her second night in the wastes, and it had been the only beautiful thing in her field of vision, and she had decided it meant something, even if she had to decide what. The healer nodded. "Mira, I'm Aldra. You'll sleep in the back room. You'll eat what we have. And in the morning, you'll start earning your keep." She was alive. That night, lying on a straw mat in a room that smelled of dried herbs and smoke, and the particular dense quiet of a place that did not care about kings or courts, Lyra put her hand on her stomach and said very quietly, to the child who would not hear it and could not understand it, but was alive and real and entirely hers, "You're going to be all right. Whatever I have to do, you're going to be all right." Outside, the northern wind moved through the dark like something that had forgotten what it was looking for. She had not forgotten. She was only getting started. Somewhere, 500 miles south, inside the warmth and light of a capital city that did not know yet what it had made, a message was delivered to Celine's private chamber. The woman who received it read it once, then twice, then set it down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone absorbing an unexpected complication. The message was simple. It was from the palace physician. It stated in the precise professional language of a man who had sworn an oath and then broken it for reasons that would take a separate accounting, one clinical fact that changed the entire calculation. The exiled queen was pregnant at the time of her banishment. Celine read the message a third time. Then she picked up a candle and burned it. The village of Ashmark had no walls and no ambitions. That was why it survived. It sat 40 miles past the empire's northern boundary on a shelf of rock above a frozen river, and the people who lived in it had come there the same way Lyra had, through a gate that closed behind them, with whatever they could carry and whatever they could not afford to leave. Exiles, dissenters, deserters, and the particular category of person who had simply made one too many enemies in a place that kept careful records of such things. They were not a community in any warm sense of the word. They were a collection of people who had each, independently, decided that survival was a sufficient reason to stay near other people who had also decided to survive. Lyra understood them immediately. She had never understood anyone so fast in her life. She worked her keep through the first winter the way Aldra had laid it out, practical, unornamented, without complaint. She managed the village's supply records, which had previously been kept in a system so chaotic it had resulted in 3 near-starvation winters that could have been prevented with basic accounting. She reorganized the trade barter system with the 2 other outpost villages within traveling distance. She negotiated a supply arrangement with a passing merchant caravan that gave Ashmark access to salt, oil, and preserved meat in exchange for the river's winter-caught fish, which the caravan resold at a substantial markup to settlements further south. She did not tell the caravan leader what the markup was worth. She filed that information in the part of her mind she had begun to think of as the inventory. Not rage, not grievance, just data, accurate, organized, and available when needed. Her son was born in the deep heart of the second winter. Aldra delivered him in the back room of the healer's house while a storm hammered the roof hard enough to feel like intention. He came out loud and furious and with a full head of dark hair, and when Aldra put him on her chest and he went quiet, not calm, but listening, his eyes unfocused and his whole small body oriented toward her voice, Lyra felt something reorganize itself inside her chest with a finality that had no name in any of the 6 languages she could read. She named him Cassian. Not for anyone. Just because it was strong and old and did not belong to the Empire's naming traditions, and she wanted him to belong to something she had chosen. She looked at his face for a long time that first night while the storm moved on and Aldra slept in the other room. He had Kaelen's eyes. Not the color, the structure, the particular deep-set quality, the heaviness of the lid. She had known it was possible. She had known it when she felt him move for the first time in the wastes, and had decided it did not matter. She looked at her son's eyes and thought, "You are not his. You are mine." And then she looked at the ceiling and she let herself feel everything she had not felt since the night she walked through the ward. Not the grief, which she had already processed into something harder and more useful, but the anger. Real anger, specific and named, without apology or qualification. She felt it for exactly as long as it needed to last. Then she put it in the inventory where it would keep without spoiling. She slept 4 hours and woke to feed Cassian and began calculating what the next 5 years needed to look like. The calculation was not complicated. The Empire's border ward would run for 5 years. She had no name that connected her to Lyra Ashbourne. She had a child who would be walking and talking by the time the ward lifted. She had a set of skills that most people in the northern outposts had no equivalent to, not because she was extraordinary, but because the Empire's education system produced people capable of running large, complex systems. And outside the Empire's borders, there were almost no such people. She had been trained to be useful to power. She was going to train herself to be power. She started with information. Information was the Empire's most underestimated currency in the Northern Territories. The outpost settlements had no coordinated intelligence network. They operated in isolation, each village knowing only what its nearest neighbors knew, which meant all of them were perpetually making decisions with incomplete data. The merchant caravans knew more than anyone else because they moved, and movement was how information traveled. Lyra cultivated the caravans with the patient, specific attention of a woman who understood that the most valuable thing you could offer a merchant was useful knowledge, and the most useful knowledge was accurate knowledge. And accurate knowledge was only possible if you built a system for collecting and verifying it. She did not call it an intelligence network. She called it a trade coordination service. The distinction mattered. Networks implied conspiracy. Services implied utility. She charged for the service in kind: salt, medicine, tools, and she kept the payment structures low enough that using the service was obviously cheaper than not using it. Within 18 months, she had 17 settlements contributing information to the system and benefiting from it. She knew the condition of roads, the disposition of territorial militias, the location of imperial patrols, the names and habits of every significant merchant operating in the Northern Territories, and the outstanding grievances of approximately 40 regional power brokers who had reasons of their own to want leverage against the Empire's interests. None of them knew who she was. They knew her as Mira. Some of them had begun to call her something else, a name that had started as caravan gossip and had graduated to something more functional: the Silver Luna. Because she paid in silver when she paid in coin, and because she had a quality in negotiation that one merchant had described to another as feeling like the moon, you knew it was there. You could see what it illuminated, but you could not look directly at it without difficulty. She found the name useful. She did not correct it. Cassian turned too. He walked early, not unusually early, but with a deliberateness that made people look twice, as if he had decided walking was a project and had planned the approach. He spoke in short, specific sentences that sounded nothing like a toddler's approximations, and a great deal like someone who had been listening to adults talk for 2 years and had been quietly building a vocabulary. He had her cheekbones and her posture and Kaelen's eyes and a particular quality of stillness that had come from neither of them, something of his own, already, at 2 years old, that she recognized as self-possession and resolved not to drill out of him. She taught him the names of things with the same care she had once applied to learning the legal codes of 3 empires. She taught him to count before he could write, and to read before most children his age were reliable with letters. Not because she was building something for him to inherit, because she wanted him equipped. She had started thinking very seriously about what came next. The merchant named Roan was the first person to come to Ashmark specifically to see her. He was 38, lean, with the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his life outdoors assessing distances, and he ran the largest independent caravan operation in the Northern Territories. He arrived on a gray afternoon in the 3rd year and found her in the storage building where she was checking a salt shipment against its invoice. "You're the one they call the Silver Luna," he said from the doorway. "I'm Mira," she said. She did not look up from the invoice. "Right," he said. "Mira." He came in and stood near the salt barrels with his hands in his coat pockets, studying her with the frank, calculating attention of a man whose survival had always depended on reading people accurately. "I've been watching your network for 8 months. The accuracy rate on your route information is better than anything the Empire's official channels put out." "The Empire's channels have political filters," she said. "I don't." "That's useful," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to formalize an arrangement." She put the invoice down and looked at him for the first time. She read him the same way she had always read rooms, calm, fast, organized, without sentiment. He was not a man who offered formalized arrangements lightly. He was not a man who made a point of finding specific people unless he had already concluded the person was worth the effort. He had come to her because someone had told him to come to her, or because he had heard enough from enough separate sources that he'd drawn his own conclusion. Either way, he had done the work before he walked through the door, which meant he already knew what he wanted. "What kind of arrangement?" she said. "You get access to my full caravan route network and first delivery priority on any goods you specify. I get exclusive use of your intelligence service for northern route planning." He watched her. "And I stop asking questions about who you actually are." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Cassian was in the village yard with Aldra, learning the names of plants in the way children learn things when nobody made it a lesson, by following an adult around and asking questions until the adult ran out of answers. "You can ask questions," she said. "You just won't get answers." "Fair," he said. "And you don't own exclusive use of anything," she said. "I don't do exclusivity. It creates dependencies that are bad for both parties." "Then first priority." "First priority on route planning, yes." She picked up the invoice again. "I'll also need access to your eastern contacts, the ones inside the Empire's trade districts." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a different kind of arrangement." "I know. she said. He thought about it with the economy of a man who did not spend more time deciding things than was necessary. What do you want with Empire-side contacts? Information, she said. The same thing I want with everything. Information about what, specifically? She did not answer immediately. She set the invoice on the barrel top and looked at him with the specific directness she used when she needed someone to understand that the answer she was about to give was exactly as complete as she intended it to be. About a woman named Selene, and the men in the Imperial Council who owe her their positions. Roan studied her face. Whatever he found there made him very still for a moment. That's capital city territory, he said. That's not just information work. That's... I know what it is, she said. You're building toward something. I'm always building toward something, she said. So are you. That's why you're here. He was quiet again. Then he said in a different tone, not negotiating anymore, but just saying something true. Who did they exile? She looked at him. Nobody exiles someone who runs a network like yours in 3 years from nothing unless they're genuinely afraid of what that person can do, he said. So who did they exile? A woman who knew too much about how things worked, she said, and not enough about what it costs to let people who want you dead get close enough to build the case. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, one slow nod, the nod of a man who had heard an answer that was not the full truth, and had also heard that the full truth was not on offer and had decided that was sufficient. East contacts, he said. I'll make the introductions. They'll want payment. I'll handle payment, she said. He left. She stood in the salt storage for a moment in the quiet after his footsteps faded, her hand flat on the barrel top, and she breathed. The inventory shifted. Roan's network, Empire-side contacts, the records Harwick had been keeping for 3 years in whatever secure location an old chancellor trusted, and she had to trust that he had kept them, because she could not verify it yet. And trust calibrated against evidence was not the same as blind faith. The shape of what she was building had always been clear in outline. Now, it was beginning to have weight. She went out to find Cassian. He was crouched in the dirt with a stick, drawing something geometric with the focused absorption of a child who has temporarily forgotten the world exists outside the project. She sat down on the cold ground next to him without comment. He showed her the drawing without being asked. A rough map, she realized. The village, the river, the road north. What's this? She said, pointing to a mark beyond the northern road. Where we haven't been yet, he said. She looked at the mark. How do you know there's something there? He looked at her with Kaelen's eyes in her own face's expression. The particular flat patience of someone who finds the question slightly beneath the obvious. There's always something, he said. You just have to go far enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Yes, that's right. The 4th year was when the Empire's troubles started becoming visible from the outside. The information came through Rowan's eastern contacts in pieces, individual reports that she assembled into a pattern with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned in 4 years of exile that partial data was the most dangerous kind because it created the illusion of understanding without the substance. She verified each report against at least 2 separate sources before she allowed it to change her picture. Old habits from the Queen's oversight work. The habits had survived the exile. They had grown sharper, if anything, the way tools grew sharper when they were used on harder materials. What the picture showed was this: the Empire was losing cohesion in its outer territories. 3 border lords had stopped paying the capital's levies, citing supply shortages and administrative failures. A drought in the southern agricultural districts had created a food distribution crisis that the Crown had handled badly, first ignoring it, then responding with martial enforcement instead of supply management, which had produced 2 minor uprisings that were suppressed but not resolved. The Treasury was showing shortfalls that could not be fully explained by the drought alone. And Selene was running the council, not officially. Officially, she was still the king's, the Eastern contact was precise about terminology, companion. But the new appointment she had secured in year 1 had given her a working majority on the Review Council, and through that majority, she had begun influencing appointments to the Treasury, the Supply Office, and the Border Command. Kaelen presided. Celine decided. The arrangement had the structural integrity of a building where the decorative columns were carrying the load, functional until a specific kind of stress was applied. Lyra read the reports and thought, she is a very good builder. I'll give her that. She builds the way termites build, inside the structure, invisible, until the structure is more termite than wall. She thought, she made a mistake though. She let the visible problems accumulate faster than the invisible ones. She's managing the king and managing the council and managing the optics, and the one thing she cannot manage is the territories, because the territories don't care about optics. They care about salt delivery and harvest yield, and whether the militia gets paid on schedule. She thought, 5 years. When the ward lifts, the territories will be ready for someone who can show them what the rot looks like from the inside. The night the border ward lifted, she was sitting at the table in the house she had built in the second year, larger than the back room at Aldra's, 2 rooms plus a workspace, with a proper hearth and shelves along the eastern wall holding the records of 4 years of network operations. Cassian was asleep in the inner room. The fire was low. Outside, the northern wind was doing what it always did, moving without explanation and without apology. She did not feel the ward lift. There was no sensation, no signal, but Rowan had told her the scheduled date, and she had counted the days, and tonight was the night. And she sat at the table with a cup of cooling tea, and she thought about the capital. The fires in the great hall, the silver at the high table, the green velvet gown on the bed. She thought about Kaelen's face at the sentencing hearing, the relief, the look of a man who had found a door. She thought about Celine reading a message in a private chamber, and a candle burning a piece of paper to ash, and a woman calculating whether an exiled queen and an unborn child were problems that had solved themselves. She thought, you should have made sure. She let the warmth of that particular thought sit in her chest for exactly the amount of time it needed. Not satisfaction, not yet. Something more structural. The feeling of a foundation being verified. She stood up. She went to the shelves and took down the master ledger. 4 years of contacts, names, debts, leverage, verified intelligence, and the particular record of a chancellor named Harwick who had promised to keep documents in a safe place, and who she intended to find out if he had kept his word. She opened the ledger to the first page and looked at the careful columns, the small, precise handwriting that looked nothing like her old court hand, and she thought about the grand anniversary celebration that would happen in the capital in 3 months. The Empire's 77th year, large gathering, all the territorial lords in one place, all the dignitaries, the full court. She thought, that is exactly the kind of room that needed someone who understood how it was built. She thought, that is exactly the kind of room I know better than anyone alive. She closed the ledger. She went to Cassian's door and looked in at him, dark-haired, still, breathing with the deep certainty of a child who had never questioned whether the person watching over him was capable of what needed to be done. He was 4 years old. He had her intelligence and her patience and the bones of a man who had not deserved him and did not yet know he existed. He was the most powerful thing she had ever built, and he did not know that either, and she intended to let him stay a child for as long as possible while also making sure he was exactly as prepared as the world would eventually require. She thought, in 3 months, I'm going to walk back into that hall. She thought, and this time I'm not leaving through the north gate. She went back to her table and sat down and opened the ledger to the contacts page for the Eastern Territories, and she began planning the trip to the capital the same way she planned everything, methodically, completely, and without the faintest tremor of the woman who had stood at the northern gate 5 years ago with frostbitten fingers and a child no one knew about, watching the capital's lights diminish behind her in the cold dark. That woman had been the beginning. The woman at the table was what the beginning had produced. Outside, the border ward was down, the road south was open, and somewhere in a warm, fire-lit capital that did not know yet what was coming back to it, a king sat on a throne built on evidence that had never been real. And a woman named Celine looked at the anniversary calendar and thought, as she always thought, that she had planned for every variable. She had not planned for this one. The road south took 3 weeks. Lyra traveled it the way she had traveled everything for 5 years, in pieces, through intermediaries, with no single person knowing the full shape of the route. Rowan's network provided the logistics. A caravan leg to the border crossing at Marin's Pass, then a merchant contact's spare room in the first imperial town, then a series of short hops through the interior territories using names and faces that meant nothing to imperial checkpoints. She dressed like a trader's wife. She kept Cassian close and told him, in the flat practical way she told him things, that they were going to a city and that he should watch everything and ask her questions later. He said, "Is it dangerous?" She said, "Some things are." He thought about that for a moment, with the particular economy of a child who had learned that her answers were exactly as complete as she intended them to be. Then he said, "Okay," and went back to looking out the caravan window at the changing landscape, the snow giving way to mud and then to the dark winter soil of the imperial interior, the outpost villages giving way to proper towns with walls and gates and guards in imperial colors. She watched him watch it, and she thought, he has never seen this. None of this. He does not know yet that any of it was supposed to be his by right of blood. She had spent 5 years deciding whether to tell him, and she had concluded, with the same methodical process she applied to everything, that the answer was not yet. Not because the truth was a weapon she was saving, because he was 4 years old and the truth was heavy, and he was not yet large enough to carry it without it changing his shape. She had brought the master ledger and 3 separate sealed packets of documentation, copies of Harwick's records, obtained through Rowan's Eastern contacts in the second year when she had finally been able to verify that the old chancellor had kept his word. The originals were still with Harwick, presumably. She had not made contact with him directly. She would do that inside the capital, and she would do it carefully, because Harwick was either still alive and still careful, or he was dead, and someone had his records, and she could not know which until she was close enough to find out. The capital came into view on the 18th day of travel, rising above the winter plain in its familiar configuration of walls and towers, and the central palace complex that caught the pale afternoon light on its stone faces. She had not seen it for 5 years. She had imagined it many times, not with longing, but with the specific attention of someone memorizing an opponent's movements. Seeing it again was not emotional in the way she had anticipated. It was more like looking at a map and finding the territory smaller than the cartography had suggested. She had made it bigger in her memory than it was. She entered through the merchant's gate with a caravan from the southern grain districts, 1 anonymous woman and 1 small boy among 40 traders and their goods, and she walked into the capital city of the empire she had once helped run, and she breathed its particular smell, wood smoke and stone and the river that ran below the eastern walls, and she felt nothing that could not be used. The safe house was a rented room above a tanner's workshop in the trade district, arranged through 3 layers of intermediary. She settled Cassian with the woman who ran the boarding house, a former Empire-side contact of Rowan's who asked no questions for reasons Lyra did not investigate. And she went out alone into the streets of the capital for the first time in 5 years. She spent the first 2 days watching. She watched the movement of guards and the timing of shifts. She watched the composition of the noble retinues arriving for the anniversary gathering, who had come, who had sent proxies, which territorial lords had made the trip personally, versus whose absence signaled something worth noting. She watched the merchants around the palace supply gate and the clerks entering the treasury annex and the quiet, unremarked traffic of people moving through the capital with purposes they did not announce. She rebuilt her map of the city's functional anatomy the way a person rebuilds a skill after a long absence, with effort at first, then with increasing fluency, until the city's rhythms were sitting in her body again like an old language. On the 3rd day, she found Harwick. He was alive. He was 68 and thinner than she remembered, with the careful, conserved movements of a man who had learned to exist in a reduced space without drawing attention to the reduction. He was no longer Lord Chancellor. That appointment had been replaced in the 3rd year of her exile, one of Celine's council restructuring moves. He was listed now as a senior administrative advisor, a title that meant he still had access to the palace but no formal authority, a deliberate demotion that kept him visible enough to be watched and powerless enough to be ignored. He had kept the records. She met him in a bookshop in the University District, a place he had clearly used for private meetings before. The proprietor was an old man who did not look up when they came in and did not look up when they left. Harwick sat across from her at the small table in the back room and looked at her face for a long time without speaking. "You're alive," he said finally. I told you I intended to be, she said. You look different. I am different. He nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who had been holding something for years without knowing when or whether he'd be able to put it down. The records are completed, he said. I've added to them. There's material from the past 2 years that you won't have from the outside. Specifics on the Treasury irregularities, the border lord payments that were redirected, the death of the king's father. She went still. Say that again. Harwick looked at her with those honest eyes. The king's father. His death 3 years ago was listed as a seizure of the heart. The palace physician who certified the death was the same physician who was replaced 6 months after the certification. He was given a modest settlement and a posting to an eastern outpost. He paused. I've been investigating it carefully. The evidence isn't conclusive in the way a court would require, but it is strongly suggestive. Lyra sat with that for a moment. The old king had died in his sleep, 2 years into her exile. She had heard about it through the caravan network. She had filed it as information and not looked at it closely because at the time she had not had access to the detail that would make it meaningful. Now she was looking at it, and it was arranging itself into a shape she recognized. The shape of a woman who did not leave loose ends. She killed him, Lyra said. Not a question. I believe so, Harwick said. The old king was skeptical of her. He had asked me privately in the months before his death whether the evidence against you had seemed properly assembled to me. What did you tell him? I told him it had not. Harwick's hands were still on the table, folded with the precise control of a man managing something strong. He died 11 days later. The room was very quiet. Outside, the university district's afternoon traffic moved past. Students, clerks, the ordinary noise of a city that did not know what was being assembled 2 floors below street level. Lyra thought about Kaelen. She thought about him finding out. She thought about the specific quality of what that knowledge would do to a man who had already been carrying the guilt of what he had done to her, adding to it the knowledge that the woman he had chosen had killed his father to secure her position. She thought about it and then she put it away because she could not afford to think about Kaelen right now, and she was no longer in the business of spending energy on things she could not use yet. I need the records in a form I can present publicly, she said. At the anniversary gathering. Harwick was quiet. That's 3 days from now, he said. I know. The council is... They're not what they were, Lyra. He used her name. Not your grace, not the formal address. Her name, the way he might have said it if they were the same age and the same rank. 2 people speaking plainly about a hard thing. The gathering will have guards loyal to Celine's faction, in addition to the regular palace security. If she sees you in that hall, she'll try to have me removed, Lyra said. Yes, I know. Or worse than removed. I know that too. She looked at him directly. Harwick, I have been building toward this for 5 years. I have a complete intelligence network covering the Northern Territories and the Eastern Trade Districts. I have 12 territorial lords who owe me favors they don't know I intend to collect. I have documentation of every fabrication in my case, the Treasury irregularities, the council appointments, and the death of the king's father. And I have... She stopped. She thought about Cassian in the boarding house 2 streets over, asleep by now, trusting her with the complete and unexamined trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt. I have very good reasons to make sure this works. Harwick looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I'll have the records compiled by tomorrow evening. Thank you, she said. She was almost at the door when he said her name again. She turned. The king, he said. He's not well. I don't mean his health. I mean, he searched for the word. He's not the man you married. I don't say that to wound you. I say it because I think you need to know that whatever you were hoping to find when you look at him, it may not be there. She thought about the man who had told her in the dark that she was the only honest thing in the palace. She thought about the man who had looked at her at the sentencing hearing and felt relief. I stopped hoping for things to be there a long time ago, she said. I stopped hoping for things and started building them instead. She left. The day of the anniversary gathering, Lyra arrived at the palace with the morning supply caravans. a trader's pass obtained through a contact in the Provisioners' Guild, her face unremarkable in the press of workers moving through the service entrance. She had dressed with care, not the queen's formal gown, not the practical exile's wool, but something precisely calibrated, the quality of a wealthy merchant, the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms like this, nothing that announced itself as either threat or supplication. She had left Cassian at the boarding house with instructions and a letter sealed and addressed to Edric, her brother at the southern garrison. If she did not return by midnight, the woman was to send the letter. She had told Cassian she would be back before dark. He had looked at her with Kaelin's eyes and her own expression and said, "I know." She had not told him where she was going. He was 4. He did not need to carry that. She found her position in the gallery above the great hall 2 hours before the gathering began, and she watched the room fill from above, the way a person who has built something watches it being used, noting the structural points, the load-bearing elements, where the weight was concentrated and where the gaps were. She saw Kaelen arrive. He had aged, not badly. He was still the same man in outline, still the jaw and the posture and the formal bearing she had watched walk into hundreds of rooms. But there was something different in the way he carried himself now, something that was not the settled authority of a king who trusted his own judgment. He moved like a man who had been making decisions for years inside a system he did not fully understand, and who had begun to sense the misunderstanding without being able to identify its source. He sat at the high table and she watched his eyes move around the room with a quality she recognized, not looking for threats exactly, looking for something that should be there and wasn't. She watched Celine arrive 6 minutes later. Same calculated positioning, 1 step behind, 1 step left, the grammar of proximity that said everything without saying anything. She was dressed in the Empire's colors now, the crimson and silver that Lyra had worn for 4 years. She moved through the room with complete confidence, the specific confidence of a person who believes they have controlled every variable. Her eyes swept the room in professional assessment, and for one moment they swept the gallery, and Lyra stood absolutely still in the shadow of the gallery pillar and breathed slowly and waited until those eyes moved on. The gathering began. Speeches, ceremony, the formal address from the king. Lyra moved. She had identified 11 people in the room beforehand, territorial lords and allied representatives who had received information or assistance through her network over the past 5 years without knowing its source. She was not going to reveal herself to all of them. She was going to reveal herself to 3, specifically, men who had private grievances with the current council and enough standing to matter when the moment came. She had arranged the introductions through Roan's contacts with the careful indirection of someone who understood that the most powerful lever was the one that appeared to be moving on its own. The first conversation happened in the corridor outside the second hall. Lord Voss, the white-haired territorial leader who had looked at Kaelen with something close to accusation during her sentencing 5 years ago, was alone for 4 minutes between the formal address and the first toast. She stepped in front of him. He stopped. He stared at her face with the particular expression of a man whose mind is doing 2 things simultaneously, recognizing and refusing to trust the recognition. "Lord Voss," she said, "that is—" He stopped. He looked at her with those sharp old eyes. "That is not possible." "It's entirely possible," she said. "I need 4 minutes." He gave her 8. By the end of them, he was very still and very pale, and looking at her with an expression she had seen on men before when they realized they had been wrong about something important for a long time. She did not ask him for anything yet. She gave him a single piece of information, the name of the physician who had certified the old king's death, and the location of the eastern outpost he had been transferred to, and she told him to verify it himself, tonight, through his own channels. "And if it verifies," he said, "then tomorrow you'll know what to do," she said. She moved. The second and third conversations were shorter, sharper, their targets already primed by years of the network's information flowing in their direction. She planted the same seed in different soil. Not the full story, but the specific detail that would make each man start pulling the thread on his own. The most powerful evidence was always the evidence people assembled themselves. That was something she had learned in the first year at Ashmark, negotiating supply disputes between villages who did not trust outside arbitration. You did not tell people what to think. You gave them the piece that made the picture coherent and let them see it. She was back in the gallery when it happened. She heard the commotion before she understood it. A raised voice, the particular acoustics of a disruption in a formal space, the shuffle and shift of a crowd responding to something unexpected. She looked down into the hall, and her stomach went cold in the specific, structural way it went cold when a plan developed a fracture. Cassian was in the hall. He was standing just inside the main entrance, her son, 4 years old, in the coat she had left him in at the boarding house. With the boarding house woman nowhere in sight and 2 of Celine's personal guards already moving toward him with the focused purpose of people who had been given a very specific description. She had been found, not by accident, not by bad luck. The boarding house woman, Roan's contact, vouched through 3 layers of intermediary, had sold her. The timeline was clear and brutal. Someone had been watching Roan's network, had traced a contact, had put an observer in the boarding house district. She had been identified before she arrived, or shortly after, and the woman had been given instructions and had followed them. And Cassian had woken up alone in a strange room in a strange city and had done the only thing a 4-year-old who trusted his mother completely would do. He had come to find her. Lyra was moving before she finished the thought. She came off the gallery stairs at speed and into the main hall corridor and through the side door, and she was on the floor of the great hall in 30 seconds, cutting through the formal gathering with the direct, deliberate movement of someone who did not have time to be subtle. The guards were closer. They had a straight line, she had angles. But she had grown up in this building, and she knew the floor plan down to the placement of the service doors, and she took a route that bought her 6 seconds. She reached Cassian. She put her hand on his shoulder and felt him turn to her with complete relief, the uncomplicated, total relief of a child finding a parent. And she put herself between him and the approaching guards, and she straightened up to her full height, and she looked at the 2 guards with the flat, specific authority of a woman who had run this palace for 4 years. "Stand down," she said. They did not stand down. They were Celine's men, not the palace's, and they did not answer to the authority in her voice because that authority had been ruled invalid 5 years ago in a hearing in this same building. "That's the exiled queen," one of them said, for the benefit of the room, which had gone quiet around them. 300 people again. 5 years later. The same fires. The same silver. She looked at the room. Then she looked up at the high table. Kaelen had stood up. He was looking at her from across the room with an expression she had not planned for. Not anger, not the performed neutrality of the sentencing hearing, but something raw and unguarded that did not belong in a formal gathering and could not be managed. He was looking at her face, and then his eyes dropped to Cassian, standing at her side, and she watched the recognition move across his face like something breaking open slowly. The particular recognition of a man seeing his own eyes in a child's face for the first time and understanding everything he had not known he was missing. She had not planned for this moment to happen now. She had planned for it to happen differently. Controlled, documented, with the evidence in place and the witnesses positioned. She had planned for it to happen on her terms, in her timing, with 5 years of preparation fully deployed. Celine saw his face. She followed his gaze to the boy, and in that instant, in the half-second before she composed herself back into control, Lyra saw something in Celine's eyes that told her exactly how much danger they were in. Not calculation, not management, fear. The kind of fear that made a woman who had killed a king and fabricated treason and built an empire inside an empire decide in under 3 seconds that the problem needed to end tonight. Celine leaned toward the guard captain at her shoulder and said something very quiet. The guard captain moved toward the service corridor. Lyra looked at the room, the frozen, watching faces, the territorial lords who had just begun to understand that something was happening that they had not been briefed on. Harwick at the edge of the room, with his hands folded and his face unreadable. Lord Voss watching with sharp old eyes that had already begun to calculate. She looked at Kaelen, still standing, still staring at the boy with that broken open expression. She looked at Celine, who was already composing her face back into its formal arrangement, and who was, Lyra understood with absolute certainty, going to make a move before the night was over that would make every move Lyra had planned irrelevant. 5 years of architecture, and it had come to this: 300 witnesses, a 4-year-old child, and a woman who had just decided that an assassination was simpler than an exposure. Lyra put her hand on Cassian's shoulder and felt his small, steady weight against her palm. She thought, all right, then we do it tonight. She thought, I didn't come back to wait. She looked at the room, all of it, all at once, the fires and the silver and the faces and the man on his feet at the high table who had just seen his own son for the first time, and she opened her mouth. She spoke to the room the way she had always spoken to rooms, not loudly, but with a precision that cut through noise the way a clean edge cuts through cloth. My name is Lyra Ashbourne. I was queen of this empire for 4 years. 5 years ago, I was exiled on fabricated charges of treason. Tonight, I am going to show every person in this hall exactly how those charges were built, who built them, and what else was built alongside them. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight, not shock. Shock was brief and dissipated. This was the silence of 300 people simultaneously recalibrating, each one running their own calculation about what the presence of this woman in this room meant for everything they had believed to be settled. Celine's voice came from the high table, composed and level and carrying just enough of the right kind of concern to sound like authority. Guards, remove the intruder. 4 guards moved from the perimeter. Lord Voss moved faster. He stepped into the path of the nearest guard with the unhurried solidity of a man who had been a territorial lord for 30 years, and who had, in the past 3 hours, verified the name of a physician and the location of an eastern outpost, and drawn the conclusion that a woman he had watched be walked out of this hall 5 years ago had been telling the truth. He did not touch the guard. He simply stood in the way and looked at him with the flat, settled authority of 60 years of rank. Stand down, Voss said. Let her speak. The guard stopped. Not because Voss outranked Celine's appointment, because the room was watching and the room had gone still in a way that made every person in it feel the specific gravity of the next decision. Guards read rooms. These guards read this one and stopped moving. 2 other lords had stepped forward from the crowd. Men Lyra had not briefed, had not contacted, but who had clearly been doing their own calculations about the past 3 years of treasury irregularities and border levy redirections and the slow, grinding administrative failures that had been costing them money and men and territory. They stepped forward not because she had asked them to, but because they had been waiting for a door to open and she had opened it. Celine looked at the room. Lyra watched her do it, watched the precise, controlled assessment of a woman measuring variables. What she saw in Celine's face in that 3-second window was not panic. It was the focused recalibration of a person who had survived this long by being faster than the problem. Celine sat down. She folded her hands. She composed her expression into the specific neutrality of someone who has decided to let a situation develop because they have already chosen where to intervene in it. That was the wrong read. Lyra knew it instantly. The sitting down was not concession, it was positioning. Somewhere in this palace, the guard captain was in a service corridor receiving instructions. She needed to move faster than the instructions. Harwick, she said. He was already coming. He had been waiting at the room's edge with the patience of a man who had spent 5 years holding a door shut and was finally, at the age of 68, going to open it. He carried a leather satchel. He set it on the nearest table without ceremony and opened it, and began laying out documents with the methodical precision of a man who understood that the weight of evidence was proportional to how carefully it was presented. These are the original trade route records from the Northern Border District, he said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to addressing chambers. Annotated with the correspondence inserted into them approximately 6 weeks before the Review Council convened 5 years ago. The annotations identify the paper stock, the ink composition, and the seal impression as inconsistent with the Queen's office records from the same period. A lord near the front of the crowd reached for the nearest document. Harwick let him take it. Lyra kept talking. She did not look at the documents. She looked at the room, at the faces, reading them the way she had always read rooms, tracking the shifts and recalibrations in real time. The Review Council that found against me 5 years ago was composed of 7 members. 5 of those 7 were appointed in the 4 months preceding the charges. The appointments were recommended by the individual currently seated at the high table. She did not point. She did not need to. Every eye in the room already knew where to go. I have the appointment records. I have the correspondence recommending each appointment. I have the financial records showing what each appointee received in the 12 months following their appointment. The murmur in the room had a specific texture now, not the uncertain murmur of people unsure what they were hearing, but the low focused sound of people connecting information they already had to information they were receiving. The territorial lords who had been managing the fallout of the past 3 years' administrative failures were doing arithmetic. She could see it in their faces. She had always been good at reading the arithmetic in people's faces. "There's more," she said, "and it is significantly worse." She paused. She let the pause sit. This was the moment she had spent 5 years preparing, and she was not going to spend it rushing. 3 years ago, the king's father died. The palace physician certified the death as a failure of the heart. That physician was replaced 6 months later and transferred to an eastern outpost with a settlement of Harwick. 4,000 imperial marks, Harwick said, without looking up from the documents. 4,000 marks, Lyra said, to a man with 30 years of palace service and no documented reason to leave. We have located that physician. We have his statement. And the statement describes a consultation he received from a woman matching a specific description in the week preceding the old king's death regarding the quantity and delivery method of a compound derived from Harwick. Vethane root extract, Harwick said. Odorless and liquid. Mimics cardiac failure at sufficient dosage. The compound is documented in the imperial apothecary records as having been ordered 3 times in the 18 months preceding the old king's death. The room went completely still. Not the careful political stillness of people managing their reactions. The involuntary stillness of people whose bodies had understood something before their minds had finished processing it. Kaelen had not sat down. He was still standing at the high table, and Lyra looked at him now, really looked at him, for the first time tonight, and what she saw broke the last managed distance she had been maintaining around the question of what he was. He was a man who had just been handed the knowledge that the woman he had chosen over everything else had killed his father. She could see it moving through him the way seismic movement moved through stone, not on the surface, but in the structure, in the deep load-bearing places where a person kept the things they believed were unshakable. His face was the face of a man whose world had not just cracked, it had inverted. Celine stood up. She did it with the controlled grace of someone who had rehearsed standing up in difficult rooms. These are the fabrications of an exiled traitor who spent 5 years in the northern wastes building a criminal network, she said, and her voice was excellent, measured, authoritative, carrying the weight of the crimson and silver she had worn long enough that half the room had forgotten they were not hers. She has returned with forged documents and a child she claims is the king's, and she has done so on the night of the Empire's celebration with the deliberate intent to, "Is he mine?" Kaelen's voice cut across everything. It was not loud. It had the flat, stripped quality of a man who had burned through every layer of performance and was operating from something underneath. He was not looking at Lyra when he said it. He was looking at Cassian. Cassian was standing at Lyra's left side, his small hand closed around 2 fingers of her right hand, watching the room with the wide, absorbing attention of a child who understood that something enormous was happening and had decided that understanding it completely was more important than being afraid of it. He had Kaelen's eyes. In the light of the great hall, with 300 people watching and every fire burning in its iron hearth, the resemblance was not subtle. It was the kind of resemblance that bypassed argument and went directly to the place in a person's chest where certainty lived. Lyra looked at Kaelen. "Yes," she said. The word landed in the room the way the original accusation had landed 5 years ago, with the sharp, clarifying sound of something irrevocable being sealed. But this time it sealed something different. This time the irrevocable thing was the truth. Kaelen looked at his son for a long moment. Cassian looked back at him with the unselfconscious directness of a child who has not yet learned that some looks are too costly to give freely. Then Kaelen turned and looked at Celine. It was the worst thing Lyra had ever watched, not because it was violent, but because it was the opposite. It was the absolute stillness of a man who had just understood the total architecture of his own manipulation and who had no response to it that was adequate to the scale of the thing. He looked at Celine with those eyes, and she looked back at him with the composed, assessing expression of a woman trying to calculate whether this was survivable. "Get out," he said. "Kaelen, get out of that chair," he said. "Get away from that table. Get out of those clothes." His voice was very quiet. The quiet of something structural failing, not the noise of collapse, but the silence before it. "You wore my father's colors at his funeral. You stood at my side at his burial, and you—" He stopped. The muscles in his jaw worked. "You killed him. That is a fabrication assembled by—" "Stop!" The word had no volume and absolute authority. "I watched her records come apart in a hearing room 5 years ago, and I know what fabrication looks like. I know what real evidence looks like. I know what your face looks like when you're managing something." He looked at her with those eyes that had once looked at Lyra with relief. "I know what you look like when you're afraid." Celine was afraid. Lyra could see it. The specific fear of a woman who had built everything on the accuracy of her reading of one person and was now watching that person slip entirely off her map. It was in that moment, Kaelen's voice still settling in the air, the room's attention fully on the high table, that Lyra heard it. The service door on the east wall. The particular sound of a door opened by someone who did not want to be heard opening it. The soft-soled step of a man with professional training moving along the wall inside the room's perimeter. She had heard Celine give the instruction. She had known it was coming. She had kept half of her attention on every door in the room for the past 10 minutes precisely because of this. She moved before the guard captain fully cleared the service corridor. She moved without explaining or signaling. She stepped forward and to the left, putting herself between the trajectory and Cassian, and she said in a voice pitched exactly to cut through the room without shouting, "Guard captain, every person in this hall sees you right now." He stopped. He was 6 feet from the service door and 30 feet from where she stood, and he had the particular frozen expression of a man whose instructions had included the assumption of a less public moment. 300 people turned to look at him. There were things a hired man could survive. An assassination attempt witnessed by 300 nobles, territorial lords, and foreign dignitaries was not among them, and every person in the room understood that simultaneously, including the guard captain. His hand, which had been moving toward the short blade at his hip, went still. Voss said from somewhere in the crowd, with the flat certainty of a man who had made his decision, "Arrest him." 2 of the palace's regular guards, not Celine's, the Empire's, men who answered to the Crown's command structure and who had been watching the past 15 minutes with the focused attention of soldiers trying to determine which side of a line they were standing on, moved toward the guard captain. He did not run. Running would have been the last mistake. He put his hands out, and he let them take him, and the room breathed. Celine was still standing at the high table. She was still composed. Lyra watched her be composed and felt a cold, specific respect for it that she did not allow to become anything softer than respect. This was a woman who had planned for a very long time and had executed with genuine precision and had built something that had functioned for 5 years inside the most guarded political structure in the empire. She was dangerous. She had always been dangerous. The danger did not diminish because she was cornered. It concentrated. "You have forged documents," Celine said, and her voice was still level. She was speaking to the room, not to Lyra. She was still trying to manage the room. "You have a physician who can be paid to say anything. You have a child whose parentage cannot be verified tonight in this hall, and you have the political theater of a woman who was exiled for crimes the court found proven." She looked at the assembled lords with the measured directness of someone who had cultivated each of those relationships and knew exactly how deep each obligation ran. "The Empire's stability cannot be held hostage to the personal grievances of—" "Lord Commander," Lyra said. The Lord Commander of the Imperial Guard, a man named Ceres, 60 years old, who had served under the old king and then under Kaelen and who had spent 3 years watching the guard structure be quietly reorganized around him, straightened from his position near the main entrance. The documentation in Lord Chancellor Harwick's satchel includes signed statements from 17 members of the supply chain that was used to redirect border levies into private accounts, Lyra said. It includes the names of the accounts. It includes the payment records for the guard captain who just tried to cross this room. She looked at Ceres directly. Your men, not hers. Your duty. Saris looked at the satchel. He looked at Harwick, who met his eyes with the honest steadiness of a man who had nothing left to protect except the truth. He looked at Kaelen, who was standing at the high table with his hands flat on its surface and his face carrying the expression of a man who has just understood that he no longer has the authority to stop what he put in motion 5 years ago. Then Saris looked at Selene. "Lady Selene," he said, "you'll come with my men." She did not move immediately. In the 3 seconds before she moved, Lyra watched her face go through something that was not quite resignation and not quite acceptance, but was the particular internal settling of a person who has run every remaining calculation and found that none of them produced a survivable outcome. Then she put her hands out in the way of someone who had decided that composure was the last territory she would not surrender, and 2 of Saris's men came to either side of her, and she walked with them out of the great hall with her spine straight and her expression controlled and her eyes fixed on the middle distance in the way of someone who is already planning the next thing. The room was silent. Then it was not silent. It was the low building sound of 300 people releasing 5 years of managed uncertainty all at once. The sound of a story's shape becoming clear after a long time of having only pieces of it. Lyra looked at Cassian. He was watching the door through which Selene had walked with the focused, absorbing attention he gave everything. Then he looked up at her and said, in his short, specific way, "Is it done?" "Not yet," she said. "Almost." She looked at Kaelen. He was looking at her. The relief she had seen in his eyes 5 years ago was entirely gone. What was there instead was harder to name. The expression of a man standing in a room that he has just understood he destroyed himself, looking at the person who had rebuilt it without him, trying to find the words for something that may not have words adequate to the weight of what he had done and what it had cost. He opened his mouth. The main doors of the great hall burst open. The man who came through them was breathing hard. A courier, from the look of him, rode dusty and pale. He pushed through the crowd at the entrance with the particular urgency of someone carrying information too large for normal protocol. He made it to the center of the room and looked for authority and found Saris. "My Lord Commander," he said, and his voice was not steady. "The Eastern Territories. The 3 border lords who stopped levy payment, they've moved." He stopped to pull breath. "They're not requesting renegotiation. They have an army. They've been 3 days from the capital since before the gathering. Someone told them. Someone gave them the date. They were told the Empire would be exposed tonight. They were told to be ready to move into the power vacuum." The room understood before Lyra did. She was half a second behind it. The particular coldness of a person who has just realized that the game they were playing was inside a larger game they had not fully mapped. She thought, Selene had a contingency. She thought she always knew this night was a possibility. She always knew I might come back. She thought, she built a door on the other side. If she fell, the Empire fell with her. If she was taken, the Eastern Lords moved and the capital became a contested territory before morning. Everything that had been built, everything that had been exposed tonight, it meant nothing if the Empire collapsed around it by dawn. She thought, she built it so that destroying her meant destroying everything. She looked at the documents in Harwick's satchel. She looked at the lords in the room, the ones she had cultivated, the ones she had not, the ones who were already calculating whether a collapsing empire was an opportunity or a catastrophe depending on which side they chose in the next 10 minutes. She looked at Cassian, who was looking at her with his steady, absorbing gaze and waiting. She thought, I came back to build something, not to watch it burn. She thought, all right, then we don't let it burn. She looked at Saris. She looked at Voss. She looked at the room. All of it, all at once. The fires and the evidence and the waiting faces of 300 people who needed someone to tell them what came next. She opened her mouth. She spoke for 11 minutes, not to the room as an audience, to the room as a working body. The territorial lords, the allied commanders, the foreign dignitaries who had come to celebrate an anniversary and were now standing inside the most significant political realignment the empire had seen in a generation. She spoke the way she had always spoken when the work was real and the margin was thin, without decoration, without appeal to emotion, with the specific precision of a person who understood that clarity was the only currency that functioned under pressure. The Eastern Army was 3 days out. That was the operational fact everything else had to organize around. The border lords had been positioned by Celine's contingency planning, a fail-safe built into the architecture of her power that said, in effect, if I fall, the structure falls with me. It was elegant and it was ruthless, and it was exactly the kind of move that a woman who had spent years inside the machinery of an empire would make. Lyra had made similar calculations herself, in the Northern Territories, building redundancies into her network so that no single point of failure could collapse the whole. She understood the logic. She did not intend to let it work. The Eastern Lords moved on a signal, she said. The signal was tonight's exposure. They were told to be ready, which means they've been in position for at least 2 weeks, waiting for confirmation that the capital's authority structure was in crisis. She looked at Saris. Which means they are not a surprise offensive. They are an opportunistic one. And opportunistic armies have a different vulnerability than strategic ones. What vulnerability? Saris said. They need the opportunity to still exist when they arrive, she said. Right now they believe the capital is in chaos. They believe there is a power vacuum. If there is no vacuum, if they arrive to find a unified command structure and a clear chain of authority, they have 3 options: negotiate, retreat, or attack a prepared position, which is a different military calculation entirely. Saris looked at her with the professional attention of a man reassessing who he was taking orders from. You're proposing we send a delegation. I'm proposing we send a message, she said, tonight, before they get another report from whatever contact they have in the capital. The message says the situation is resolved, the Empire's authority is intact, and the 3 lords will be given the opportunity to present their grievances, their legitimate grievances about levy structures and supply failures, through proper channels. Not as a concession, as an offer that is significantly more survivable than the alternative. And if they don't take it, Lord Voss said, then we have 3 days to finish positioning, she said, which is more than enough time if we start now. The room worked. That was the thing she had always known about rooms full of powerful people. Given a clear problem and a workable solution, they worked. The territorial lords broke into operational clusters with their advisors. Saris moved his commanders to a side room for immediate military coordination. Harwick began cataloging the documentation for what would need to be a formal legal proceeding in the morning. The foreign dignitaries from allied territories gathered in a tight group near the east wall and spoke in low voices and watched with the calculating attention of people determining how their governments would need to respond to the morning's news. Lyra moved through all of it, answering questions, redirecting energy, making the 100 small decisions that kept a large, complicated effort from fracturing under its own weight. This was the work she had always done, the invisible architecture. The difference now was that the room knew she was doing it. At some point in the second hour, she realized Cassian had fallen asleep. He was on a bench along the north wall, curled on his side with his coat pulled over him, one hand tucked under his cheek, sleeping with the complete physical trust of a child who has decided the situation is handled. She looked at him from across the room and felt something move through her that was not one thing. Not relief and not grief and not love, exactly, though it contained all of those. It was more like recognition. The recognition of a person looking at the thing that had kept them moving through the worst of it and understanding fully and without sentimentality what that thing had actually cost and what it had been worth. She had carried him through the northern wastes at 17 weeks pregnant. She had built a network and a reputation and a 5-year plan with her hand on his sleeping bag in the cold of the Ashmark winters, telling him stories in the dark in the particular low voice she used when she needed him to stay calm, understanding even then that the stories were as much for her as for him. He had never known any of it as sacrifice. He had known it as his life, the healer Aldra, the village, the lessons, the mother who read maps for breakfast and taught him to count in 2 languages before he was 3. He had known it as ordinary. She had made it ordinary for him deliberately, with everything she had. She went back to work. The message to the Eastern Lords went out before midnight, carried by 2 of Saris's fastest riders with a formal seal that was technically not valid. The Lord Commander's seal, not the Crown's, because the question of whose seal carried authority was one of the several things that needed to be formally resolved in the morning. Saris had looked at her when he pressed the wax and said,
This carries your authority, whether it says so or not. She had not argued. She had filed it in the inventory and moved on. It was close to the second hour past midnight when she finally stopped moving. The great hall had thinned. The lords and their retinues had dispersed to their guest quarters and their planning sessions. Harwick was in the archive room with 2 assistants, organizing the documentation for morning. Ceres's men had the palace perimeter and the city gates. Celine was in a secure room in the eastern tower under guard, and the guard captain was in the lower cells, and the machinery of formal accounting was already turning around both of them with the slow, grinding inevitability of institutional process. The hall was nearly empty. The fires had burned low in their iron hearths. The silver on the high table caught the reduced light and held it in dull, tired gleams. Lyra stood near the center of the room and looked at it, all of it, the place she had built feasts in and managed crises in, and been walked out of. And she felt the specific, deep exhaustion of a person who has been running at maximum capacity for 5 years and has just completed the final sprint. She heard him before she saw him. Kaelen came in through the side door alone. He moved carefully, the way he always moved when he was carrying something difficult. The same quality she had recognized years ago as the way he moved after nightmares, when the unguarded version came out and the performance went off. He stopped 10 feet from her and looked at her face and did not say anything for a long moment. She waited. She had learned in 5 years of exile that she did not need to fill silence anymore. Silence was information. What a person did with silence told her more than most of what they said inside it. "I didn't know about the child," he said. "I want you to know that. I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said. "I would have—" He stopped. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I don't know what I would have done. That's the honest answer. I've been sitting with it for the past 2 hours, and the honest answer is, I don't know, and I'm not going to tell you something that sounds better than the honest answer." She looked at him. The man she had slept beside for 4 years. The man whose nightmares she had pulled him out of with a firm, quiet voice. The man who had looked at a door and chosen to walk through it. He was 41 years old, and he looked it in a way he hadn't at 36. Not aged badly, but aged truly, the way a person aged when they had been carrying guilt that didn't have anywhere to put itself down. "Your father," she said. Something moved through his face like a physical thing. "Yes." "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. Not for him exactly, or not only for him. For the old king who had asked Harwick whether the evidence looked properly assembled and had died 11 days later. For the version of the story where that question had gone the other way. For the particular weight of finding out that the person you trusted most was the instrument of the worst loss you had suffered. She knew something about that weight. She had been carrying its mirror image for 5 years. "She played me from the first day," Kaelen said. His voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man who has finished being shocked and has arrived at the terrain of reckoning. "Every decision I thought was mine, every appointment, the case against you. She handed me the pieces and I put them together exactly the way she needed me to." "You chose to put them together," Lyra said. "Not cruelty, accuracy. She handed you a story that was convenient, and you chose to believe it because believing it was easier than what believing me would have required." He held her gaze. He did not flinch from it. She gave him that. He did not flinch from the accurate thing. "Yes," he said. "That's right." "I know," she said. "I knew it at the sentencing. That's why I didn't fight harder. You can't argue someone out of a choice they've already made because it's easier than the alternative. I understood that. I just—" She stopped. She looked at the low fires in the iron hearths, and she thought about the rock overhang in the northern wastes, her back against cold stone, her hand on her stomach, the particular sound the wind made when it had no direction. "I just didn't understand how cold it was going to get before it got better." Kaelen looked at his hands. "What do you need from me?" he said. Not for us. I understand there is no us. I mean, for the morning, for what comes next. Whatever I can do to make it right in the ways it can still be made right. Tell me what you need, and I'll do it."
This was the question she had been building toward for 5 years without knowing it was the question. Not the exposure, not the evidence, not the Eastern Lords or the Council restructuring or the documentation in Harwick's satchel. The question underneath all of it, the structural question, what did she need from the man who had destroyed her, now that she had survived the destruction and built something from the rubble he didn't know existed? She thought about it with the same methodical honesty she applied to everything. "I need you to abdicate cleanly," she said, "without resistance and without conditions. The Lords need to see it done clearly. If you fight it, or negotiate it, or try to retain any formal role, it gives the Eastern Lords a legitimate grievance to organize around. A clean abdication removes the variable." He nodded once, slowly. "Done. And I need you to acknowledge Cassian formally before the abdication. Publicly. In writing, entered into the imperial record. Not as your heir. He is not going to carry your legacy. He is going to carry his own. But as your son, and as a member of the Vayner bloodline, which gives him standing in the succession laws that the new council will need to work with." "Done," he said. "What else?" "Nothing else," she said. "From you." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Can I meet him?" She considered it. She looked at the bench along the north wall where Cassian was still sleeping, one hand under his cheek, entirely unknowing. She thought about what she owed her son. Not protection from difficult truths, not the edited version of the world, but the real one, given at the right pace and with the right preparation. He was 4 years old. The real version could wait a little longer. "Not tonight," she said. "When he's older, when he can ask his own questions and get answers on his own terms." She looked at Kaelen directly. "And if he decides he doesn't want to, that is his decision. Not yours. Not mine." "Understood," he said. He turned to go. He got 3 steps toward the side door and then he stopped, his back to her, and he said something to the room rather than to her directly, the way people said the things they couldn't say face to face. "You would have been the best ruler this empire ever had," he said. "I knew that when I married you. I knew it the whole time. He stopped. "I let myself forget it when forgetting was convenient." She looked at his back. She thought about the woman she had been at the sentencing hearing, composed, direct, putting her hand on her stomach and deciding not to spend the child as currency, walking out under her own power. She thought about what that woman had become in 5 years of cold and silence and methodical patient building. She thought about whether what Kaelen was saying was supposed to change something, and she found, with the clarity of someone looking at a solved equation, that it did not. Not because she was still angry. The anger had been in the inventory for years and had long since converted into something more structural, more useful. But because she had not done any of it for his recognition, and receiving his recognition now did not retroactively make it about him. "Go get some sleep," she said. "The abdication is in the morning, and you'll need to be clear-headed for the language." He left. She stood in the empty hall for a moment longer. Then she went to the bench and sat beside her sleeping son, and she put her hand on his back and felt him breathe, and she looked at the low fires and the silver and the high table, and she thought about the girl who had stood in the doorway of this hall 4 years before her exile and looked at all of it, the careful, beautiful, fragile construction of an empire, and believed she was building something that would last. She had been right. She had just been wrong about which empire. The abdication happened at the 10th hour of the morning, in the formal council chamber, with the full attendance of the territorial lords and the Lord Commander and the representatives of the allied territories who had stayed over from the gathering. Kaelen read the document in his formal voice, the same voice that had sentenced her 5 years ago, the voice of a man performing authority. And when he finished reading it, he set it down and he signed it, and he pushed it across the table to Harwick, and he did not look at anyone in the room except, briefly, at Lyra. She met his eyes. She did not nod. She did not give him absolution or acknowledgement or the particular look of a woman who has forgiven a man for the convenience of the moment. She gave him accurate attention, the same attention she would give anyone who had done what they said they would do. He had done what he said he would do. That was all it was. He left the council chamber with 2 personal attendants and without ceremony, and the room watched him go and then turned back to the work of what came next. The Eastern Lords accepted the delegation's terms. The news came on the 2nd day. A message through Ceres's riders that was terse and careful and said, in the language of men who had just discovered that the opportunity they had mobilized for no longer existed, that they were prepared to discuss the levy restructuring through formal channels. She had expected it. An opportunistic army needed an opportunity. She had closed the opening before they arrived. The formal council met for the first time in the new configuration on the fourth day. The appointments were Lyra's, made with the same methodical care she had applied to everything. Not loyalty tests, not political rewards, but competence assessments. She had been watching the Empire's administrative failures for 3 years from the outside, and she knew precisely where the rot had gone deepest and what kind of person was needed to replace it. Harwick was reinstated as Lord Chancellor, not because she owed him a great deal, but debt was not a governance principle, because he was the most qualified person available, and because the Empire needed someone at the head of its legal apparatus whose records were impeccable and whose methods were verifiable. Celine's trial was formal and thorough and took 3 weeks. The evidence was extensive. The physician's statement about the compound and the consultation held under cross-examination from 3 separate questioners, the financial records from the Treasury redirections, the appointment correspondence, the guard captain's testimony given in exchange for a reduced sentence which confirmed the instruction he had received and the chain of authority it came from. The verdict was unanimous across a 12-member judicial panel. The sentencing was life confinement in the Eastern Tower, which was, Lyra thought, both just and functional. Just because the crimes warranted it, functional because execution created martyrs, and confinement created cautionary examples, and the Empire had more use for cautionary examples right now than for martyrs. The coronation was 3 months later. They called it a coronation because the legal apparatus needed a word for it, but it was less like the coronations Lyra had organized for others and more like a formalization of something that had already happened. The moment in the Great Hall when she had opened her mouth and told a fractured room what to do next, and the room had done it. Authority was not bestowed, she had learned. It was recognized. The ceremony was the recognition made official. The crown was the visible symbol of something that had already been settled by the hard work of the preceding months. She wore dark green, not the velvet of the old court gown. She had left that on a bed 5 years ago and had no interest in its symbolism. This was wool and leather in the northern cut she had been wearing for 5 years, formal in its construction but functional in its design, the kind of thing a woman wore who intended to work in what she was dressed in. The territorial lords looked at it, and some of them smiled with the particular smile of men who understood the message. The foreign dignitaries looked at it with careful, assessing expressions. The Allied Pact representatives, who had come in numbers she had not fully anticipated, word having traveled through the northern territories about the Silver Luna and what she had built and what she had come back from, looked at it and nodded. Cassian stood at her left side during the ceremony. He was dressed simply, in clean dark clothes, his hair combed for the occasion and already coming undone at the front in the way it always did. He watched the proceedings with his particular focused attention, absorbing everything, asking nothing until afterward, when they were alone in the corridor outside the chamber, and he looked up at her and said, "Are you in charge now?" "Yes," she said. "Of everything?" "Of enough of it," she said. He thought about that with the economy of a child who trusted her answers. "Good," he said. Then he took her hand and looked at the corridor ahead of them, the palace's long stone passageway, lit by torches, leading toward the working rooms where the afternoon's business was already waiting. "Can we eat first?" She laughed. It was the laugh of a woman who had not laughed in a long time. Not a performance of it, but the real thing, the involuntary thing, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere below the inventory and the calculations and the careful, methodical business of surviving and building and returning. It came out of her like something that had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had apparently been her 4-year-old son asking about lunch in the corridor of the palace she had just taken back. "Yes," she said, "we can eat first." The first year of her administration was not easy. She had not expected it to be easy. The empire she had inherited was not the empire she had helped run 4 years before her exile. It was smaller in effective authority, larger in accumulated damage, riddled with the structural failures of 3 years of Celine's financial management and the border lord crisis and the administrative appointments that had filled positions with loyalty rather than competence. She worked on it the way she had worked on everything since the exile, methodically, without sentimentality, with the patient specificity of a person who had learned that large problems were only large collections of small problems, and small problems yielded to attention and time. The levy restructuring with the Eastern border lords took 4 months of careful negotiation. She did it herself, in person, traveling to the Eastern territories with Harwick and a small retinue, and sitting across tables from men who had been ready to march on the capital, and who were now trying to recalibrate their relationship with an authority structure that looked nothing like what it had before. She listened more than she spoke. She had always been better at listening than most people gave her credit for. The negotiations concluded with a restructured levy system that was less profitable for the capital in the short term and significantly more stable in the long term, because it was built on actual supply chain data instead of political assumptions. The border lords signed it. 2 of them shook her hand afterward with the expression of men who had been expecting an adversary and had encountered something else. Kaelen left the capital in the 4th month. She heard about it through the administrative record, a formal departure notice, a small retinue, a destination in the Western Territories where his mother's family had an estate. She read the notice and put it in the regular correspondence file and moved to the next document. She did not watch him go. She had said what she needed to say in the Great Hall, and then said what she needed to say in the night after the abdication, and there was nothing left that needed saying. The shape of what had happened between them was not a wound anymore. It was a scar, functional, structural, a part of the tissue that had formed in the cold of the northern wastes and had been what she was built from. And you did not mourn a scar. You noted it as part of the record of what had happened to you, and you moved. What she had not expected, what she had been too practical to anticipate and too careful to let herself want, was the specific texture of what came after the building was done. She had spent 5 years focused on the return. The return had become so completely the organizing principle of her internal life that she had not fully thought through what she would feel when the return was over and the building was underway, and the problem was no longer survival but something larger and more ordinary: governance, stability, the daily grinding maintenance of an empire that was trying to become better than what it had been. She had not thought through that it would feel like enough. That was the thing she had not anticipated. Not triumph, Sharkin. Triumph was brief, and she had learned to distrust brief things. Not vindication. Vindication was for people who had needed others to confirm what they already knew, and she had stopped needing that somewhere in the second winter at Ashmark. Just enough. The particular durable feeling of a life that had arrived at the shape it was supposed to have. Not perfect, not finished. Nothing governing was ever finished. But right, in the structural sense. The feeling of load-bearing elements in the correct positions. She found it, of all places, at breakfast. 6 months into the administration, on an ordinary morning in the winter, in the small dining room she had taken as her working breakfast space because it had a window that faced east and got the morning light before any other room in the palace. Cassian was across the table from her, eating with the focused efficiency of a child who has figured out that eating quickly means more time for whatever comes next. Harwick's daily brief was at her left hand. The fire was going in the small hearth. Outside, the capital was beginning its morning. Smoke from chimneys, the gate guard changing, the ordinary noise of a city that was, slowly and imperfectly, and with the particular friction of large things changing their direction, becoming something different from what it had been. She put her hand flat on the brief, and she looked at her son, and she thought about the girl who had stood at the north gate on a midnight in the worst cold she had ever felt, with a pack on her back and a child no one knew about and the lights of the capital diminishing behind her. She thought about what that girl had known, standing there, that she had not been able to name at the time. She had known, not hoped, not wished, but known, with the flat unreasonable certainty of something that lived below calculation, that this was not the end. She had not known what came next. She had not known the wastes, or Aldra, or Roan, or the network, or Cassian's voice saying, "You just have to go far enough." She had not known any of the specific shapes that the next 5 years would take. She had only known that the woman walking through the ward was not finished, and that not finished was a kind of power. And that power, given enough time and enough cold and enough work, built its own architecture. She had been right. That was all. That was the whole of it.
She picked up the brief and began to read. Across the table, Cassian finished eating and looked out the east window at the morning light on the Capitol's stone walls, and his expression was the expression of a child who has not yet learned that the world is small, who still finds it, every morning, larger than the day before. She looked at his face and she thought, yes, that's exactly right. That's what we're building it for. The morning light moved across the table between them. Outside, the Empire breathed.